Yirmiyahu was a prophet, was a good chaver of mine. Never understood a single word he said, but we helped him to drink his yain. And we always have some mighty fine yain. Singing Simchat Le'olam, Kol HaYiladim now. Simcha to the doggy in the deep blue sea. Simcha to you and me.
Welcome to the Haftarah Plethora video podcast, where we might not bring joy to the world, but we do talk about prophets like Jeremiah and kings like David and Solomon, and our own king of cantillation, Rick Muller.
Well, we don't really talk about me. Besides, I'm no King David or Solomon.
It's true, Rick. You are not a king like either David or Solomon, and I'm glad of that, because today's reading about the last words of King David are not particularly flattering. And the fact that Solomon carried out the bloodthirsty instructions of his father is not the kind of filial loyalty that I would think you expect either. But more on that in a moment. I'm Larry Herman, sipping some very fine wine and talking Haftarah to my good chaver, Rick Muller, the king of cantillation. How are you doing, Rick?
I'm tired. I'm okay. I had some hot chocolate. Lauren made me some hot chocolate, and I've got my water here, but I'm doing all right.
It's a cold and chilly and damp day, isn't it?
Yeah. So I don't know why you're mentioning me next to King David and Solomon, but go for it.
You deserve to be so honored. Not only is your chanting beautiful and precise, but your weekly trope drashes elevate our understanding of the text. And I'm sure that this week will be the same. On the other hand, I just wrestle with the context and straightforward meaning of the text. And this week we have a fascinating study in contrasts.
I assume you're referring to the contrast in the deathbed scenes. In the Parshat, we're reading about Jacob blessing his children and grandchildren, his instructions of what they're supposed to do upon his death. In the Haftarah, we read David's instructions to Solomon, very different.
In truth, they absolutely couldn't be more different, which is what I wanted to talk about, at least to start. In the Parsha, Jacob first offers blessings to each of his children. Actually, he brings them together to tell them their future. Each is addressed individually, somewhat cryptically, and often disapprovingly. And then Jacob instructs them to bury him with his ancestors in the cave at Machpelah. David, on the other hand, is speaking only to Solomon, not an assembly of children. And he really offers no blessing at all. Instead, he has two very different sets of instructions, so different that it's very clear that one set was inserted into an older text.
Are you starting with critical Bible scholarship here?
I'm only pointing out what Robert Alter and others have observed, and which should be apparent to anyone reading the text in Hebrew, or in a good translation. The language, the content, and the tone of verses 2 to 4 are very different from those of verses 5 through 9.
And what about the concluding verses 10 to 12?
Could go either way. In any case, the beginning of our Haftarah reads like the book of Deuteronomy, with David basically instructing Solomon to be a good Jew, or at least a follower of God and all the commandments. He even harkens back to the teaching of Moses, even though that was not at all in keeping with the way the rest of the David story is written. It's a change, it's a charge, and it's a promise. I'm going to read you the altered translation of these verses, which I've abbreviated only slightly, and listen to the tone here. He starts off, "You must be strong and be a man, and keep what the Lord your God enjoins, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, as it is written in the teaching of Moses, so that you may prosper in everything you do, so that the Lord may fulfill his word that he spoke unto me, saying, if your sons keep their way to walk before me in truth, with their whole heart and with their whole being, no man of yours shall be cut off from the throne of Israel."
Sounds like sage advice. What's not to like?
Absolutely nothing. If you're a prophet speaking to the people, or even if you're a prophet speaking to the heir of the throne, or if you're the Torah speaking to the people, this "with your whole heart and with your whole being" is reminiscent of the words of the Shema. Levavecha V'nafshecha, very, very similar. But the tone and the subject change in verse 5. In the next 5 verses, David offers Solomon, to quote Alter, a last will and testament worthy of a dying mafia capo. Use your savvy to pay off all my old scores with my enemies.
End quote. That was Alter. Ouch, that's brutal.
Yes, but the brutality is not just in Alter's characterization, but in the text of those verses. David twice instructs Solomon to use his guile and wits to bring David's enemies' gray heads down in blood, down to Sheol. This is hardly the stuff of walk in the ways of Adonai your God, is it?
No, it's not. But I think the trope helped to make your point. So, do you want to tell the divisions, or how do we want to do this?
Well, we think that I think it makes sense to divide it up, reading verses 1 through 4, which basically are what I'm going to call the Deuteronomist insertion here, which is the very high-minded charge to Solomon to be a good Jew, a good follower of Adonai and all the commandments,
Yes.
which is really out of context. Verses 5 through 9, which Alter calls the gangster capo, telling him to go after his enemies,
Yes.
and then conclude with verses 10 through 12, which is basically the narrator coming back to describe the end of the story, the David's death, and Solomon taking over.
Okay. So in 1 through 4, the most important trope, the rarest trope, is the diber alai, the zarka, in verse 4. Lemor is the segol. So that's always a pronouncement like koamar in a lot of haftorahs. Thus said the Lord. So diber alai, God told me, speaking lemor. So that's the highlight of that section, and everything leads up to that point. You have the kadma, the azla before it and after it. Very dramatic bookends. God is established. Yakim Adonai is the two kadma azla there, and then Yishmaru vanecha, guard your children.
No, if your children will guard.
Yeah.
So and in fact, that's David's talking to Solomon. He's talking about him.
Yes.
If Solomon will actually keep the ways that he just spoke about, or that he's speaking about.
And then the Zakif Gadol there, Lemor in verse 4. It's a very long verse, but that parallels the ending of the Haftarah. So it's a dramatic point there, what he says.
So a lot of solemnity here in those first 4 verses, at least in verses 3 and 4.
Yeah, and I like the pickup that you got, Bechol levavam uvechol nafsham. It's like the Ahavta, Bechol levavcha, Bechol nafshecha. So that's a direct parallel to that in Deuteronomy.
And before you chant those first 4 verses, Rick, I just want to point out that the command here, as is explained in Eitz Chaim,
at the beginning, Vayetzav,
Vayetzav is exactly the same verb that's used in our Parsha, with Jacob also commanding or instructing or charging, depending on how you want to translate it, his children.
Yes.
And that's given a special trope, a tavir.
Mm-hmm. Right.
All right, so how about if we start chanting following the first of the bracha?
Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Vayikrevu yemei David lamut vayetzav et Shlomo v'no lemor Anochi holech b'derech kol haaretz v'chazakta v'hayita le'ish v'shamarta et mishmeret Adonai Elohecha lalechet bidrachav lishmor chukotav mitzvotav umishpatav ve'edotav kakatuv b'torat Moshe lema'an taskil et kol asher ta'aseh ve'et kol asher tifne sham lema'an yakim Adonai et dvaro asher diber alai lemur im yishmeru vanecha et darkam lalechet lefanai be'emet bechol levavam ubechol nafsham lemur lo yikare lecha ish me'al kisei Yisrael.
Very nice. But now I think as we get to the next 5 verses, we're done with the God talk. We're done with all the talk about following commandments and what the future will bring. And it's in these verses that David is instructing Solomon on how to carry out vengeance and which of his friends he wants to see rewarded.
Yeah. And it starts with the Pazer, the only one in the Haftarah, verse 5. And it's the dramatic, the steps towards it are unnecessary. Yadata, the third word in verse 5, yadata means you know. You don't need an ata in front of it. You don't need a vegam in front of that. Also you know. So it's emphasizing and emphasizing. Maybe this is the way David was speaking. You know, as you get old, sometimes you repeat yourself, but the triple emphasis on the words, and then yadata, the fanciest trope. You know what you should be doing, Solomon.
Right.
Don't yeah.
Or you should know.
You should know. Don't hesitate. Yeah.
And what should he know? In the next 3 words or the next trope combination here?
Right. So et asher asa li, what Yoav did to me, what this enemy of David's, he killed Avner and Amasa, so he wants to wreak vengeance on this Yoav person. And
but I think it's interesting, Rick, if you permit me, I think
Yes.
it's interesting. He's not asking Solomon to take care of national grievances or grievances against the crown. He's asking Solomon to take care of some very personal grievances, which is why I think that very dramatic Tilisha Ketana, followed by the Kadma Va'azla, Et Asher Asa Li, what they
Yeah.
did to me.
Right. Not to the people, not to the nation, but to me. Yeah. He took it personal. It was
did.
personal. It was.
And what does he tell him he's got to do?
He's got to kill him. He's got to take him out.
Yeah, but in a very special way. And it's a way that's repeated in the 2 enemies, I think. If we go down to verse,
Right.
to
Verse 6, right? The Dargah Tavir. Velo Toraid has the Dargah underneath it, and Sevato has the Tavir. And then that's repeated in verse 9. Vehorad Ta is the Dargah, and Et Sevato is the Tavir. So taking out these 2 enemies, Shim'i, later on, and in between, the sons of Barzillai get spared. Let them eat at your table, but meanwhile, kill these 2 other people. So yeah.
and I actually like the poetry, although the thought itself is pretty horrendous. The poetry of David saying, "Don't let their gray heads go down peacefully, or don't let their gray heads go down without blood."
Yeah. There's also another there, Viyadata, in verse 9, just has a pashta on it, but you'll know how to deal with him.
And that's because David had made promises. He had commitments that he couldn't kill them. So he was telling Solomon that he has to use his wits,
Right.
his wisdom.
Yeah. So I read online about Shimi, his later story. Solomon lets him live, and he puts him under house arrest. And 3 years later, Shimi forgets about it, and he goes after some slaves that ran away, and so he's caught that he went out of house arrest, and so he's put to death there. But Solomon didn't kill him right away. He let him live for a while,
showing some of that compassion we talked about a couple of weeks ago when we talked about Solomon and the story of the baby.
Yeah, or the wisdom that he couldn't take everybody out all at once. That he had to wait. He had to be patient, I suppose.
All right, enough talk. Let's get to the chanting. So let's chant verses 5 through 9.
Vegam ata yadata et asher asali Yoav ben Tzeruya asher asa lishne sarei tzivot Yisrael. That's pretty rare, all those munachs. Leavner ben Ner Vilamasav ben Yeter Vayahar game Vayasem Deme Milchama Bishalom Vayitain Deme Milchama Achagorato Asher Bemotnav Uvna Alo Asher Baraglav Ve'asita Kechochmatecha, your wisdom, Velo Tored Sevato V'Shalom Sheol Velivnei Varzilai Hagiladi Ta'aseh Chesed Ve'hayu Be'ochlei Shulchanecha Kichein Karvu Elai Bevarechi mipnei Avshalom achicha v'hine imcha Shimi ben Gera ben hayemini mibachurim vehu kilalani mretzet beyom lechti machanaim V'hu yarat likrati hayardein vayeshava lo v'Adonai lemor im amitcha becharev ve'ata al tenakehu ki ish chacham ata, you're wise, ve'arata, and you know, et asher taselo Behorata et sevato bidam sheol.
Yeah, you emphasize there the fact that David's telling him that he's wise and that he knows.
Yep.
He knows what he's supposed to carry out. Well, that's the end of the charge. And the last 3 verses of the Haftarah then are what I call the narrator completing the story.
Tries to sew it up nicer, yeah.
Right. And the story basically is Vayishkav David, which gets translated as, and David slept with his et avotav, with his fathers.
Yes.
Or David lie with his fathers. I don't know which one's the better translation. And he was buried where? In the city with his name.
Yes. Actually, I did some archaeology in the city of David, 1980. The dead people weren't buried in the city. They were buried outside the city, right? On the east, Mount Scopus, Mount of Olives. That's where the dead people were. And when I was there, the Haredim, the
ultra-Orthodox.
Yeah, they protested that we were digging up the bones of the kings and stuff. And Yigal Shiloh was the head of the dig. He's gone now. Bless his soul. He was a great guy. He came to San Diego to recruit some American kids to go work in the dig. He defended the whole dig. He said, no, there's no bones in the city. They were buried outside the city. We were digging up chicken bones and animals. We weren't digging up people bones. Those are outside the city. But anyway, in the general area, yeah, he was there. But you don't bury somebody in your backyard. You bury him someplace else. But anyway.
But I guess the point is that Ir David was connected to Yerushalayim. So he He was buried
Definitely.
outside. So, any interesting trope here on the last three verses?
Yeah. So verse 12 ends with two Zakev Kadols. That's very rare that they appear all together, but to appear together is very, very rare. And so it's a dividing kind of trope. It stands alone. On top of Ushlomo, verse 12, Ushlomo, and then Yashav. So it's a real separation, I think, musically. And so it's a separation from David, that Solomon is going to be different. And of course, we all know that Solomon, because he's peaceful and wise and all that, he's not a warrior. He's the one that gets to build the temple. It's not for David, who was too stained by blood.
Absolutely. All right, you want to take it home for us?
Sure. Vayishkav David imavotav, vayikaver be'ir David, v'hayamim asher malach David al Yisrael arba'im shana, bechevron malach sheva shanim, u'v'Yerushalayim malach shloshim v'shalosh shanim, u'shlomo yashav al kisei David aviv, vatikon malchuto meod.
Very nice. You know, Rick, I think we can all wish that we will be blessed by our fathers and that we will have a chance to bless our children a bit more like Jacob than like David, and give them some vision for the future, praise them for the people that they are, and not ask them to do our dirty work. What do you think?
Yeah, exactly. Everything. Ditto.
All right. Well, we want to wish everybody a happy secular New Year, or
Yes.
Sylvester as they call it in Israel,
Okay.
and a Shabbat Shalom, and we'll see you
Shalom.
all next week.
Take care.